Hi, all. Thanks for joining us. My name is Beth Palmer. I'm a principal at Earnscliffe Strategies here in Ottawa. Earnscliffe are made up of leaders across Canada in strategic communications, government relations, and opinion research. We have offices in Ottawa, Vancouver, Toronto, and Saskatoon. I am very excited today to be able to spend some time chatting about the 2023 federal budget with my colleagues. So here today we have Ellie Alboim, who is a principal at Earnscliffe, Bud Locklear, a principal at Earnscliffe, Melanie Richer, a senior consultant with Earnscliffe, and Laura Kirkamaki, a principal with Earnscliffe. Before we kick off the discussion, I'd like to let everybody know that there is an opportunity to pose questions to our panel using the Q&A button right at the bottom of the screen. So please feel free to jump in anytime, and we will be checking in periodically with that. So we're going to kick off. We're now 2 days out from the budget. The initial flurry of interest and questions about new funding, new programs, re-announced funding, previously announced programs, it's kind of settled. So I'd like to ask all of our panelists what they see as the big takeaways. What's landed? Are there any noticeable absences? How are folks feeling? So we will kick it off with Melanie. I could go to you, please.
For sure. So of course, in the frame of maybe re-announcement, but maybe what's landing, I think that this budget was a big healthcare budget. And I think that regular folks at home will probably see that because that's probably what is most likely to impact them. Certainly, if they're part of the families that are going to be getting this dental care help in the next little bit. So I think for folks who may not totally be paying attention to every line in the budget, that's what would be resonating with me, the help that is coming so that I can get, my kids' teeth taken care of, my parents' teeth taken care of, or whatnot. In that frame as well, because it'll be some of the same families that are getting that help, the GST rebate that's coming for folks who are finding it increasingly difficult to afford things. Especially as it relates to groceries, I think that that'll be well received. And when those checks come in, I think folks will notice that was part of the budget and they'll be thankful for it. So that's who I think is most help, but also paying the most attention to what's coming, or will be paying attention once it starts affecting them.
Okay, so you're seeing the kind of key pieces as the $13 billion investment into dental care and the GST rebates as the sort of planks. Laura, maybe we'll kick over to you. If I could get your opinions on where things are at with the budget 2 days after.
Sure. I am eager to hear my colleagues' reactions as well. From my perspective, I think, I agree with a lot of what Melanie said in terms of the key themes. I think spending is still really high and there doesn't appear to be any path back to balance anytime soon. Deficit is still large. While I do think that the key themes and topics in the budget give the Liberals a lot to talk about across the country, as you're continuing to see them do. The minister out in BC and the Prime Minister continuing to do post-budget announcements. But I think from the Conservative perspective, there's a lot that's similar and continued on from the last budget, not a lot new that is going to help Canadians actually feel a little bit of relief with their bank accounts, pocketbooks, and that sort of thing. So it gives, I think, all parties something to talk about, but it also gives the Conservatives many options and items to point to where the Liberals are still kind of not meeting Canadians where they need to be.
Okay, Bud, so we have two folks sort of landing on the affordability. What about you? Where are you seeing things playing out with this budget?
Well, the key from my perspective is, the competitiveness aspect. And I think that, the government's budget did what it could do in this space. And they're operating in the shadow of the US IRA, operating the looming shadow, I think, of similar EU economic policy, which is designed to bring capital into those jurisdictions. And it's a kind of a, the way the US is framing it, it's a zero-sum game. There's only so many dollars, and where are they going to go? We want them to come here. So I think Mr. Freeland and the finance team, and actually everybody who was plugged into this budget was really looking seriously at, well, this is a big challenge. How do we make it work for us? And I think it's a competitive stance for Canada, this particular budget. There's some challenges. They haven't been able to meet some of the US benefits head on. We can talk about that in a while. But generally, moving fast, for example, the PSP Public Service Pension Plan Investment Board now being the body to house the Clean Growth Fund and have a completely different mindset in terms of deployment of that set of funds. That's a good move. That can happen. It is happening fast, and it's got a completely different ethos, I think, than the funds of money that have been allocated to Strategic Innovation Fund and in that the Net Zero Accelerator. It's a different mindset, should deploy that capital more quickly. The contracts for difference, carbon contracts for difference, are an absolutely essential tool that Canada has to deploy because of the price on carbon. The Canada Growth Fund is going to be using those. In the budget, there was an interesting reference to the development of carbon contracts for difference, sort of in a whole of government fashion. I couldn't quite put my finger on what that meant, because it's clear that contracts for difference are going to be used by the Canada Growth Fund, but unclear if there's some other avenue where those are going to be deployed. The investment tax credits that we're seeing now for clean electricity that really focuses on the big grid, includes Hydro-Quebec and BC Hydro, non-taxable parastatals, right? That's a real development, brings Indigenous groups in, folks that didn't have to, you can't use a tax credit if you don't pay taxes. Now there's a special mechanism that brings those people into that space, important players. So that's exciting, and that's good. There's a couple of issues in there, I think, that still have to be ironed out. In fact, much still needs to be ironed out. It's not clear when the various ITCs are going to be well enough baked to actually be legislated, and we're looking into that right now, exactly what state that is all in. But there's some other things that are really interesting, and that's the commitment to streamline permitting of resource projects. And say, well, gosh, that's interesting, because about a week ago there was a hearing in the Supreme Court of Canada about the Impact Assessment Act, and every province, except Nova Scotia and PEI, signed on with Alberta challenging the federal government's approach there. So, there's lots of different pieces that stack on each other. What's the economic fiscal part of this? What are the enabling features that are, outside the budget that need to come into play to make all this happen? And the impact assessment and environmental assessment of permitting, streamlining permitting, which is proposed in the budget. That's one aspect of stuff that's outside the budget, but critically important to the implementation of it. I could go on, and I will later, but I'll stop there.
Thanks, Bud. That's really interesting. I'm hearing competing challenges as they're drafting this in terms of pocketbook issues directly felt by individual Canadians, Canadian families, but also global pressures in terms of moving Canada forward and building out an economy to compete. So Ellie, I'll kick it over to you. What are your big takeaways from this budget? Ellie, you're on mute.
Of course. Trying to answer your questions. What stood out to me, I guess two or three things. One is the centrality of the clean tech, clean electricity package in the budget. Don't disagree with Melanie, but I think the health thing had been discounted because it was 2 months ago. I think the focus on electricity and clean electricity was quite extraordinary. It's going to change the nature of the federal involvement in the electricity sector. It's going to use taxpayer dollars rather than just ratepayer dollars to build out the electricity system. And the bet on electrification as the major lever on reducing climate emissions, I think was important. It was also clear to me that the focus on clean energy and clean electricity is a big bet. And it led to what's not in the budget, almost no discussion of innovation, no discussion of science and research, two big areas that needed to be addressed. Surprisingly, on housing, again, a very significant pressure point was not addressed. What else stood out in the negative sense? I think what Laura talked about. I think the impacts on the fiscal framework stand out. They were part of the framing of the budget that the minister probably did not appreciate, but was widely commented on by media and other commentators. And I think that is part of the overall framing of the budget 2 days later. I'll also note, I think, like all budgets, or at least like most budgets, this one probably doesn't have legs, as they say. I think that the coverage and debate about it will diminish very quickly. It was noticeable today. It was a workmanlike document. I think they did what they needed to do, given the constraints they were under. But it was not the transformative budget that the minister had hoped it would be, or signal it might be.
Hey, thank you. Let's build a bit on that, Ellie. I was hoping to ask you, you played a key role in writing 9 federal budgets from 1994 to 2002. And that includes the 1995 federal budget, which took significant steps towards debt reduction or deficit reduction. And 20 years later, I would say helped give the Liberals the social and political capital to run on deficits in 2015. Can you take a bit of time to sort of explain what would have been driving the decision-making processes for the government in drafting this week's budget, what kind of considerations they would have taken into account, and also a bit about the roles that would be played by both Minister Freeland and Deputy Minister Michael Sabia, what they were hoping to achieve. I've touched on it, but I'd like to get in there a bit more.
Okay, big questions. I'll try and be short. Like every budget, there are kind of 3 factors that go into or 3 considerations. And they establish the kind of permissible parameters of activity or initiative. So we start with context. What is the overall context into which the budget is falling? In 95, the context was the peso crisis, the enormous cost of debt service, the fact that Canada was about to hit the wall. We had a similar context this time of tremendous uncertainty. The emerging banking crisis, interest rate clampdown, inflation, stubborn inflation, a lot of uncertainty context. So the budget fell into a context of uncertainty that forced it, in fact, to produce scenarios going forward. The second factor, which is always important, are the pressures on government and on a budget. And the pressures in this case were very significant. We had a collapsing healthcare system. It forced a response. We had an inflation problem that forced a response from the Bank of Canada on interest rates. We had significant pressure, as Bud said, from the US, worried about investment capital coming into Canada on a competitive basis. All of that had to be addressed. And the third factor you normally look at in a budget is the policy objectives, monetary and fiscal, economic and fiscal. And unfortunately, the first 2 factors tend to cramp the space for the third. That happened clearly 2 or 3 times in the last 20 years, where the level of ambition had to be reined in very significantly because of the pressures that had to be met and the context that had to be dealt with. I think that was the case in this circumstance too. So the level of ambition on growth, on productivity, on macroeconomic policy had to be reined in. I think the minister doubled down. She tried to accomplish some of that through the virage towards clean energy and clean tech as a job creator and a growth creator. We'll see whether that is going to succeed over time. But I think that her margin of maneuver was really constrained by those two factors I talked about, the overall context and the pressures. What role did Minister and Sabia play? Critical roles. A budget is proposed by finance, accepted or rejected by the Prime Minister's office. There's a negotiation over that. I think the politics of this budget, which by the way was the other pressure I should have mentioned, very significant pressures, the minority government pressures. You know, I think that the central political imperative for the Prime Minister's office was affordability. Central imperative for finance, for Mr. Sabia and the minister, were the policy items we've talked about. I think that there was, you know, some division and tension between them as they sorted out the rough balance. But there's no doubt that the proposals generally in a budget come from minister and deputy minister. And they seek the acquiescence or from the Prime Minister or amendment by the Prime Minister. And I think that's what happened in this case.
Hey,
I should add, by the way, that Mr. Sabia, as a former very accomplished senior executive in business, his fingerprints are all over the fiscal and tax levers that are implied in the energy and electricity package.
Okay, thanks, Ellie. So I think all of these comments so far have done a really good job of capturing the very specific context that this budget was drafted in. And it really is, we're in the middle of a moment of uncertainty and there are significant external pressures. There's also, and I'd like to chat a bit about this, there are some commitments that have been made. And a year ago when the Liberals and the NDP made an agreement with the supply and confidence agreement that in exchange for advancing some key priorities, the NDP would support the Liberals on confidence motions. So the context has changed over the last year. But Melanie, I wanted to chat a bit with you around what the NDP was looking for in terms of budgetary commitments, and we've seen some fairly significant ones, and what kind of signals they're looking for in order to see this agreement through to the end of 2025. And did you think that this budget sort of delivered on these expectations?
Yeah, so maybe I'll just go back to last year. Part of the motivation for the NDP and for Jagmeet Singh to do this agreement with the Prime Minister was really their shared goal of in a time of, you know, the Freedom Convoy in Ottawa, in a time of the war in Ukraine, how can we work together, opposition and government, to actually get stuff to people? And that genuinely was Jagmeet's goal. But in that, to be strategic so that you're not, you know, all of the things that we want are happening in year one, and then year two, well, why are you still doing this? Year three, why are you still doing this? So this year we really saw the expansion of dental care, and that was definitely their big thing that they wanted. And another thing that we saw as part of the deal that was important to New Democrats was investing in good jobs that fight the climate crisis, and we did see that in this budget too. And in particular, the clause of as part of incentives that, you know, part of the process was going to, you know, good paying jobs or union jobs. So that's something that folks with the NDP are particularly proud of and excited to see that. And also the context of we're about to be in an election in Alberta. So that's maybe a little bit uncomfortable with what's happening in Alberta politics, but something that they're going to continue to work on. I would say things that obviously weren't in the budget that maybe wouldn't have been, but that the NDP is seeing as goalposts for this year is the implementation of the Pharmacare Act. And I would say they're also looking for the long-term care stuff that we still haven't seen yet, that's still in discussions. So those two things they're looking for this year. And one of the things that they were maybe disappointed about in this budget is that there was no funding for long-term care specifically. And like Ellie mentioned earlier, housing was a big one that they kind of were disappointed that they didn't see. But that also allows them to put check marks for next year. Okay, well, what are we going to be able to say? This is because of us next year. So I do think this did hit the agreement for them. They are, I think we saw, I was joking with Laura that we saw Mr. Singh come out and say he was proud 15 times. And I was like, I think he's proud. So this definitely does pass the test for folks there. And what they will want to see for this to continue is the same kind of thing. They'll want to be able to say, here are the 3 things that we asked for the next budget, and be able to say, we got these 3 things done. And if they're not able to say that, well, at that point, that's when they'll start asking themselves questions. Is this worth it for us? And we'll see.
Hey, thank you. I think it's really interesting the way you frame that in terms of the NDP asking, how can we work together, opposition and government? Particularly in light of last week, when Pierre Poilievre had a brief conversation with President Biden, and he described opposition as an act of loyalty. So Laura, where will the Conservatives be focusing their opposition to this budget? What is the narrative that they're looking to drive in doing this? And also, are there risks for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives in terms of how they position this response?
Yeah, I think that you can kind of tell where Pierre is coming from based on Melanie's reaction to the budget, which is obviously very positive. He called the budget an NDP budget. The Conservatives came out the day of the budget before it was even tabled and said they weren't going to support it. So I think, and you also heard actually former Prime Minister Harper talking about this at a conference in Ottawa last week, where he said publicly that, you know, it is the opposition's main job to oppose what the government is doing. They don't even, in his words, necessarily need to propose ideas. They just need to oppose. So I think that Pierre definitely takes that approach, although they did make some requests ahead of the budget for what they wanted to see, one of which we've talked a little bit about already is housing. So he came out very strongly saying that there was nothing that was going to, you know, bring down mortgage costs, which have almost doubled under the current government. So that was one main criticism, I would say, that was levied, which I think does hit close to home for both on the affordable home side, but also kind of the more pocketbook, people seeing their bills rise, and there's not a lot of relief there in this budget. So a little bit of what you would expect, I suppose, but I would say that he did come out very strongly against. On your point about if there is risk, you saw a little bit of pushback this week in the House, I think it was yesterday, where Minister Gould was sort of pointing out, you know, the classic, these things are in the budget, which you care about and you're voting against it, that sort of thing. But I mean, it is an old point that governments mostly use, but I mean, I'm sure that the government will point out some similarities in what they feel like was addressed in the budget, but the Conservatives feel like was not.
Okay, thank you. So, but you've mentioned that the government's really been seized with responding to the Inflation Reduction Act since it was passed last fall. Can you go over some of the challenges that would have been facing Minister Freeland in developing this budget and putting, as you and Elliot pointed out, these sort of climate policies and these sort of industrial policies forward in order to position Canada for success within this larger North American, but actually, I think, global context?
Sure. Well, as President Biden noted in his speech to Parliament last week, you know, the two countries are intertwined. You know, inextricably intertwined is maybe not a phrase he used, but it accurately describes the relationship. And once the Inflation Reduction Act was passed and signed into law by the president, it was clear that Canada was going to have to react with this new frame of the industrial policy in the USA, right? So suddenly, you know, this became an existential question for this budget. Is there's could be perceived as a protectionist effort that's a zero-sum game in terms of there's only so much capital and people want to go into the USA, and the U.S. political space is, even though the Biden administration and the Trudeau administration are fairly aligned in a lot of ways, there happens to be this problematic element in U.S. governance called the Congress. And they're saying, well, we want all this money. We want to craft this legislation so that we're, you know, we're the black hole that attracts everything, right? So how does Canada react to that? A much small open price taking economy next to this gigantic monster, which is also your major market and source of capital. So how do you do that? There's some other issues that the Canadian government needed to take into account, which was there's the carbon pricing regime in Canada. There's no carbon pricing regime. There's some regional things happening in the USA, but there's no national carbon pricing regime. So, you know, if you're talking about attracting international capital, you have to balance the carbon pricing regime with other things that make it attractive to invest in Canada versus, let's say, the USA. And then you have the other problem of the regulatory nimbleness, right? Which in the USA, depending on which jurisdiction, which state you're in, can be really fast. And you then have also just the lower labor costs. So all those factors thrown up on your doorstep, we have to address this. And we can't just, you know, let it go by. So that really, I think, switched, you know, there's a lot of consternation. You could feel it around town here in terms of how do we craft something that's unique for Canada, demonstrates Canada's value proposition to the international investment community. And I think they've done a pretty good job. And, you know, the early on folks were signaling we need to be, we can't address this across the board on a dollar for dollar basis, but we can look for unique places where we really can make a difference. And, you know, Canada seems to have landed, for example, in the cathode active materials space for electric vehicles, and the Volkswagen coming in and some of the other investments that GM and others are making suggest that, you know, the signaling from the government up to this point has been good and has hit the mark, right? So the proof of the pudding is in the eating, as they say. And, you know, the pudding is still cooling on the counter, so to speak. So we don't exactly know how this is going to act in the real world, but the signals seem good. And that means that the minister and folks in finance and actually everybody in economic ministries around town had a pretty good sense of the challenge and aggressively leaned into that challenge to provide solutions. But there's still some areas where the government couldn't really act, and the government is going to have to wait. Couldn't act in this budget. The government is going to have to wait to see how the markets react. For example, the US IRA has a number of production tax credits. There are no production tax credits in the budget that was tabled on Tuesday, and there had been rumors around town that there were going to be some production tax credits. So a production tax credit is basically the government's going to write you a check for, you know, based on the volume of object X that you're producing. The US has production tax credits now for battery manufacturing materials. I think it's $45 per kilowatt hour and of a battery pack, let's say. So, and most battery packs, I think, in automobiles are maybe, you know, about 40 to 150 kilowatt hours, something like that. So you can see if you're getting a $45 check for every, you know, portion of a kilowatt hours that you're making, suddenly over a year or 10 years, which is what the IRA is running out for, you know, on an annualized basis, that's a lot of money. And that's a key challenge point for the government of Canada. And those production tax credits appear in a variety of other sectors, including carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration, and direct air capture, technologies that Canada wants to definitely foster here. There's some great companies that are doing that work. So the finance department and people around town were seized with how do we meet this challenge? They've, I think, effectively deployed the tools that are available. Some tools aren't available, and they'd be too expensive to use. So, like I say, we're going to have to see how this goes out, but there clearly was a major, you know, there are two major pressures on the government of Canada, on the finance department, address this health and dental benefit issue and start to move us into an economic solution or an economic basis for the net zero transition.
Okay, thank you. We do have some questions in from the audience, so I'll pose one now. Which measures from this budget will have the most immediate impact on our day-to-day lives? Laura, I'll go to you first.
Hey, I honestly don't know. I don't think there's that much that is going to at least not impact my day-to-day life. I think that for lower income seniors and folks, there are some tax credits. I know, for example, the grocery rebate, but in that case, I think for a senior, for a single senior, it's a $250 one-time payment. I mean, my groceries per week are more than that. So I'm not sure how much actual relief this is going to bring to folks. There are some positive pieces. It wasn't all all negative. There are some pieces I think were good in terms of bringing in the suicide prevention hotline, which I think was a bill that was passed by one of the Conservative MPs, Todd Doherty. There was a couple of pieces requested by First Nations in terms of their financial management, which I think were good. But in terms of actually addressing affordability, which was one of the main themes of the budget, for me, I'm not sure how much it's actually going to help bring down inflation and reduce costs on families.
Okay. Ellie, any thoughts? You're on mute.
I'll learn. I'm not much different. The only point I'll make is whatever relief there is highly targeted to lower income. Put together, the measures may make some difference. Will make some difference to some lower income Canadians. But there are very few broad-based measures here that will make a difference to most people. In the long term, it's possible, of course, that the healthcare benefits will accrue to people. Certainly the dentistry benefits will get wider and wider as the years go on, but again, means tested. But this was not that kind of budget.
I'd throw something out here, which is, if you ask what's the thing that probably people reading a headline took away and brought inside and maybe felt some relief, it would have been the health and dental benefits. They know they're not going to get like a cash infusion into their bank account like the food thing, but it's addressing a major concern that Canadians have, which is like, I don't have a family physician and I don't know where to go, and it's like taking forever to get a test done. The signal from the government that there are tens of billions of dollars going out to address this probably made an emotional impact on people. Like, oh, okay, good, someone's doing something, right? Whether that checks the box at the end of the day after 6 or 8 months, that the public will have feelings known about that. Like if it doesn't work, they're going to be upset with it. But I think right now, maybe the reason we don't hear a lot of clamoring about this is that probably made people go, oh, good, somebody's listening to us and trying to do something about this, right? That's got to have an emotional impact.
Melanie, you're nodding. Anything to add or just emphatic nods?
Yeah, no. So I come at this from a different perspective than folks on this call as somebody who's in communications. I think to Bud's point, for when you're communicating this to regular folks, people really just want to feel heard. Like they want to feel like their struggles are seen, and whether the help actually makes it into their bank account or not. Just feeling like somebody who's making decisions is thinking of them when they're making decisions, I think goes a long way. I would disagree. I know the amount seems really small for a GST rebate, but if you are barely making the bills, like that's actually that could make or break for a lot of folks, and it's 11 million people. So that's not a small segment of the population. That's a big percentage of the population. And dental care, I say this story often. I was super lucky as a kid. My dad was a firefighter, so my benefits were always covered. But the first time that I went to go to the dentist, and had to pay the bill myself. I remember calling my mom and saying, how do people afford this? And her answer was, they can't, like, unless they have benefits. If they've got 3 kids, that's not something that they are doing. They're putting it off. So while a lot of us are really lucky and we have those benefits, that's not the reality of a lot of folks. So being able to bring your kids to the dentist and not be stressed about it, I think, even if it's not a big sum of money, the removing the stress from your, how are we going to make this work? I think will go a long way. So we'll see how that rolls out when the program's permanent and people start being able to get that help. But I think in a way of how does this help me tomorrow? I think those 2 things go a long way to do that.
Hey, thanks all. There are a few more questions. I'm going to jump to one of them. And Ellie, you had mentioned this initially in your sort of overview of what was missing from this budget. So one of the questions is, nothing for skills, innovation, science agendas, which marks a fairly big change in terms of Liberal budgets and previous governments, I would say. So what does this mean, and how do you expect that to change sort of looking forward?
Well, what it means is that all of those pressure points, demands from universities, the granting councils, the need to emphasize basic research, and all of those are going to go unmet in terms of an escalator. There are very significant decisions to come. Excuse me. For instance, in the Strategic Science Fund that is yet to make its awards, but I don't know what the dollar volume will be. Look, I think it just goes back to the initial dilemma she had. Do you dissipate among the whole spectrum of the spending profile, or do you focus in, at least for this one? We didn't make enough of a point, I think, that she had a legitimate concern about the level of spending that she could unleash and its impact on inflation and having fiscal policy undercut monetary policy. She said no to far more than she said yes, is my understanding. A lot of departments, particularly ISET, asked for a fair amount of money. She was aware of all the pressures. I think she made some ruthless decisions. This is an area in which she made a ruthless decision. It belies, though, the rhetoric of the last 5-6 budgets that talked about the key to productivity being innovation, science, research. So you have to hope that this is a respite for a year that will be reevaluated. I don't think we should be under any illusions. The next budget is going to be a pre-election budget. And whatever restraint there was in this budget, and that's an arguable question, because I think, she overreached on describing this as a restraint budget, but whatever restraint there was is going to disappear next March as we head into the pre-electoral cycle. So a lot of the people who had requests or demands are likely to find a more warm welcome next March, but they just may have to endure the next year. I may also say, by the way, cynically, that a budget is one thing and you try to package it together and build a narrative and have a plan, and then you live on that. But this government is famous for its off-cycle spending. What it often does is allow the thematics to go in the budget, and that quietly over the next 9 to 10 months, it spends money that was not authorized in the budget. It's called off-cycle spending. And it may very well be that some of these pent-up demands will be met when the focus is not like it is on a budget, particularly is this a restrained budget? What's your deficit line? What's your debt to GDP ratio? When that kind of stuff or that focus disappears and you simply get the opportunity to make one-off announcements, in July or September or October, this government seems much more prone to do that than previous governments have. So that community, I guess, can live on and hope that it can build enough argument for investment before next March.
Beth, I was going to pose a question. This is connected, I think, with the question about money not showing up in the budget for a certain line item thing. And it has to do with defense spending. Why is there no mention of defense spending in this budget? 4 days before the budget, the government released a big announcement of $3 or $4 extra billion we're spending on, or maybe it was $7 billion on a variety of defense-oriented things that the U.S. had wanted. Some of this, I think, appeared in the previous budget, the NORAD modernization and some other things. But there's a whole stack of additional acquisitions that the government's kind of nodding that they're going to do. So I guess the answer to that question is the same thing. It looks like there's off-cycle spending that we can expect to see over the next 12 months, perhaps. The government announced that they were going to probably go ahead and buy a series of maritime patrol aircraft. That came out just before President Biden's visit, and that will be $2 to $3 billion as well for that. So I think hopefully, I think for a lot of people, they look over the next 12 months and they say, yeah, we want to see some special spending programs to address our areas of concern.
Okay. Excellent, thanks. So I think we'll sort of move on now. Ellie, I have a question for you around deficits. So you'd mentioned a few times that the budget acknowledges a higher than projected deficit, the expectation that a balanced budget is going to take longer than the 5-year sort of framework, but also projects a lot of savings. And I think this is one of the in terms of who will be impacted, I think the government is hoping that there will be some savings from tax changes and also from reduced government spending. So how do you think that this fiscal scenario will play out? And now that we're sort of a few days out, do you think it's shaped how the public has responded to the budget? On mute.
Let me deal with those questions separately to start. I think the deficit track, which is now at about 1.5% of GDP, which is a kind of tolerable level, was worse than predicted in November. But I think the more important point is there's real vulnerability on the deficit track. Government issued 2 scenarios, a pessimistic one and an optimistic one. The pessimistic one drives the deficit up much more substantially over time. It depends on world circumstances that we talked about, in overall context before. There's no contingency reserve for the first time in a while. So if there are economic shocks, there's not much to fall back on. It will go directly to the bottom line on the deficit. On the other vulnerability is they have booked a lot of savings on government spendings that I think are at best problematic, or maybe debatable. They've already booked $6 billion worth of savings from program review that's supposed to start next year, and that is stalled at the gate. The work on it is very preliminary. They booked $7 billion worth of cutbacks on consultancies and travel. There's a 3% across the board cut in most discretionary spending. And they're scooping up unallocated money. The scooping up unallocated money will run into, as will the 3%, a lot of departments playing the musical ride game, saying, we're happy to cut it, but understand the thing that we're going to cut is something that's going to cause you political pain. Having lived through program review in 1995, I've got to tell you that is a very, very difficult and painful exercise. But they've booked the money into the framework. If all of these savings mechanisms don't come to fruition, particularly don't yield what they're supposed to yield, then they go directly to the bottom line and increase the deficit. So if you're looking at the probability, the balance of probability, it's all on the risk side, very little on the upside. And frankly, I forgot the second part of your question, so I don't.
That's okay. I saw a lot of eyebrows being raised, so I think there might be some folks looking to jump in. Laura, any comments on that? I did see some response to Ellie describing the deficit as being at a tolerable level.
Yeah, I obviously don't agree, but that's okay. Normally I do really like to give Ellie not too much of a hard time, because then he'll come back to me with facts and then I'll be in big trouble. I was actually hoping to jump in much earlier of when Melanie was talking about the dental dental care program. I think the problem that the Conservatives and others might see with it is, I think your arguments are totally fair. Of course, people need help and we want to make sure people can afford it. I think the problem is when people are like I think it's 1 in 5 Canadians are skipping meals right now. I think the problem is when those are your choices, you're not considering going to the dentist. If you're actually making choices about cutting off your heat or, you know, eating, that I don't think that that's a priority. I think that's kind of the point that the opposition are making in terms of just inflationary spending in general. So I just wanted to jump in on that one point, but not get in any type of argument about the budget with Ellie.
But I also noticed a bit of a response from you, particularly around the discussion of a contingency reserve. So any comments on that front?
Yeah, we seem to have come through a stormy period with the failure of the Silicon Valley Bank, where there was a lot of, oh my God, and you know, it seems it was contained. But still, the major, you know, the major prognosticators on the future of the economy still seem to be pointing towards a mild recession, right, coming this summer. And so this is, as Ellie pointed out, this is a potentially risky challenge. But I don't, you know, I think the government of Canada had to make these moves, and it's the risk analysis, you know, had to be done, and these decisions were made to move in these certain things and spend a certain amount of money, right? But I am really. I'm anxious to see what happens over the next 3 to 4 to 5, well, 3 months now, kind of thing. Are we really going to hit some kind of tough place? And there's a lot of factors that are exogenous to Canada that will trigger that and create a lot of havoc. Canada's not in the driver's seat on any of this. You know, I mentioned earlier, Canada's a small, open, price-taking economy. It's a policy-taking economy as well, generally, right? Because money describes or defines the politics and the policy. So I think for everybody watching this, you want to keep your finger on the pulse of what's going down in the big markets, the Federal Reserve, the EU situation, energy markets. There's so much happening that that we have no control over, but will impact us enormously.
So, but building on that, this budget is sort of reflective of what we do have control over, what we are trying to have control over, we being the Canadian government, of which I am not a part. But do you think that this budget establishes sort of enough certainty for private partners to build out this sort of industrial endeavors that the government is trying to attract and I guess retain as well?
Yeah. You know, there's a really interesting metric, and I'm going to point to a think tank, Clean Prosperity, who've examined the issue of let's compare apples to apples here between the USA and Canada, and they've looked at the bankable gap, you call it the bankable gap, which is like ITCs or PT, investment tax credits or production tax credits, and there's a dollar value associated with that, and you can usually look in Canada how much that's going to be and how much in the USA and what's the difference, right? But there's also what they describe as a total incentive gap. And that's the part I think where Canada will need to be nimble and rethink it. The total incentive gap is the price of labor, the price of inputs, the cost of extraction, the available labor. And if we talk about these big industrial projects, it's not just the labor, it's the engineering design firms, how many people there are, what's the absorptive capacity, right, of those entities globally. And if the United States is throwing a bunch of money into getting these projects and they're out the door sooner, all those EDP companies are going to be, you know, busy doing that. And so we're on the second list. The same thing with the EU. So the budget does what it can do, and using the tools available. But there's a lot of these, as I mentioned earlier, a lot of factors that fit into the total incentive gap, and the speed of pushing money out the door, the speed of making these changes happen is going to be critically important for Canada's chances of success. I think the tools are there. You have to have, the ability to implement those tools from the government side, but also the uptake, in the private sector that's doing this stuff. So, still lots of moving pieces. I'm hopeful, but we have to see where it lands.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you. So Laura, building on this, we have seen a pretty clear focus on batteries, EVs, critical minerals, and a lot of collaboration between the federal government and provincial governments. Looking most recently at the very significant announcement with Volkswagen EVs and the battery plant that's going to be built in St. Thomas, which Minister Champagne called the single largest investment in the auto sector in the history of Canada. How do you see the relationships between the federal Liberals and provincial governments sort of shaping up over the next year?
Maybe I'll just say two things or answer it in two parts. So actually talking to folks in the automotive industry after the budget was released, I think one big question was that the actual cost of the Volkswagen announcement and investment is TBD. There's no details in the budget. They have tried to find out through government officials what it is, and it seems like there's just no answer. And so I think that was part of the reason that you saw, interestingly, Pierre Poilievre actually criticized to a certain extent the announcement on social media, which then led to, I guess, some of this discussion about them sort of being at odds with the provincial government due to the fact there's joint funding, and the province and feds, as you mentioned, have been doing tons of these announcements together and are sort of in lockstep on the importance of bringing investment in critical minerals and manufacturing to Canada, specifically to Ontario. And of course, Quebec is doing a lot of the same outreach as well. But to your question about the relationship as you see kind of provincial elections popping up. So another thing I noticed this week, actually on budget day after the budget came out, was the Manitoba Premier using a lot of the same language that the federal Conservatives use about the carbon tax, and talking about the budget in the context of prices going up, affordability, carbon tax making it worse as it goes up on April 1st. So I think, listen, there are some provinces that obviously have just had elections recently that, need the federal government to partner, whether they be Conservative governments or not. But then you also see other provincial governments sort of choosing their moments ahead of, we have the upcoming Manitoba election, but first the Alberta election, which will be very interesting. So listen, I think with the specific example of Ontario, not to completely divert this conversation away from the budget, but I think you've seen Premier Ford be at times not as partisan as other premiers, and really see the federal government as a partner for getting things done that he wants to get done. I think he's been really effective in doing that.
Hey, thank you. We have about 5 minutes left, so I think just to wrap it up, I'll come back to something Ellie said earlier around packaging a narrative for the budget and sort of trying to pull together a cohesive thread. And we've kind of teased out the high level pieces, I think, sort of significant investments in healthcare and dental care. We're talking hundreds of billions of dollars into healthcare transfers, 13 billion into dental care, but also really broad incentives to encourage transitioning to a green economy, and positioning Canada as somewhere that is a competitive place for clean projects. So I guess to wrap things up, I'm hoping to get your overall sense. Is this a social policy budget? Is it a green economy budget? Is there something else at play here? Where are folks landing? Melanie, I'll start with you.
Sure. I won't pretend that this was my smart insight, but Joyce Napier earlier this week said her overall frame is that this is a very reactive budget. And I think we've said that a few times on this panel. I think the government was forced to kind of react to a few things. They had to react to the Inflation Reduction Act. They had to react to their demands that they have with the NDP, to inflation. How do we help people who are facing increased mortgage rates? But even like the small lines of the different things that the government has had in the headlines recently, the foreign interference, there was a line in the budget about that. The consulting contracts, there's a line in the budget about that. The Prime Minister's travel, there was a line in the budget about that. So I think I thought that take from Joyce was really smart. Of that, to me, seems kind of to be the frame that is playing out widely, that this was a reactive budget, and likely why we're not totally seeing them continue the frame as the week goes on. So it'll be interesting to see how that moves into the next week.
Hey, Ellie, over to you.
I guess I'm kind of harsh on the question you raised. I come from a different tradition of budget making. I think that the core storyline or narrative is very important. I think you need to be able to discern what the overall economic policy and objectives are, what the ambition is. This government has put together budgets in a different way. Its budgets are an aggregate of individual items, small items responding to different constituencies. It doesn't produce budgets that have a strong narrative thread that allows you to understand what its macroeconomic thesis is. I think this one, as Melanie said, didn't have much of that, but couldn't because of all the pressures on it. But I don't think that absent that, it would have been a whole lot better. I just don't think that they believe in a master narrative or producing a budget that that tells you what the strategy is. I think they see a budget as it is, as a much more political document that needs to satisfy a variety of constituencies.
Laura?
Yeah, maybe I would just jump in there, Beth, before handing it over to Bud. I worked in the Harper government and it was very much the same. There was obviously a large theme, narrative. It would be set up as Ellie has outlined. So yeah, I concur with a lot of what he's saying. I don't think they're getting a lot out of this, and I don't think it's helping them in the broader political spectrum.
Bud?
Well, I was going to say I agree with Mel, Ellie, and Laura, but I actually have something to add, which is maybe is it a green budget, sort of? And for me, the most interesting part of this is if you talked about the Trudeau government's focuses and things for the first few years, 2019, even to 2020, 2021, 2019, it was green. You had a regulatory frame, I think, in the budget, right, about establishing a carbon tax and limiting things. Then COVID hit, and we got through COVID, and now instead of returning, we have a solid regulatory base, I think, for the budget and everything else that was driven by ECCC, right, and the focus there. And now it's reverted more to the economic ministries, in particular finance, but also ISED and NRCan, who are driving the programs and implementing, I think, the superstructure that can allow building a clean economy. So I think for me that's an interesting distinction, is that we're seeing that regulatory part reflected in budgets and the carbon pricing, for example, that's been set. Now it's the superstructure that allows the major economic growth aspect to bring us to a clean economy. That's it.
Thank you. I really want to thank everyone on the panel for indulging my questions for a whole hour. It's such a treat. And thanks to everyone who was able to join us and put in some questions. And just want to conclude this by saying thank you, and hopefully there's more to come in terms of discussions, and that Ellie might be a little bit wrong that the budget's sort of wrapped up completely in terms of how it's being discussed. So thanks, everyone. Have a great day.